300 miles southwest of the Irish coast, the Atlantic Ocean possesses a specific, mechanical indifference. In February 1941, this stretch of water was a frontier of almost absolute isolation. Here, the continental shelf drops away, and the ocean floor plunges to depths of over 15,000 feet. The surface is rarely still. Driven by the prevailing westerlies, the swells build over thousands of miles of open water, rolling in long, gray ridges that obscure the horizon even on clear days. The temperature of the water in midwinter hovers just above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. It is cold enough to induce shock within minutes and hypothermia within the hour. The air is often colder, carrying a damp, penetrating frost that clings to steel and cloth alike. At this latitude, the sun provides little warmth, appearing only as a pale disk behind layers of stratocumulus clouds before dipping back below the jagged line of the sea. In this environment, distance is the primary enemy. The nearest land, the rocky outcrops of the Blasket Islands or the cliffs of Cornwall, lies hundreds of miles to the east. To the west, there is nothing but the open curve of the earth stretching toward Newfoundland. It is a vast, kinetic wilderness where human biology is unsustainable without the artificial shell of a ship. The ocean here does not accommodate life, it tolerates it, provided the machinery holds. When the engines stop, or the hull is breached, the environment reasserts its natural state, a cold, chaotic silence. In the winter of 1941, this silence was profound. There were no satellites to monitor the currents, no GPS signals to mark a position, and, for the vessels traveling alone, often no one listening for a distress call. The water simply waited. Into this hostile geography steamed the SS Gersapa. She was a representative vessel of the British Merchant Navy's wartime logistical struggle, an aging steel-hulled steamship, built in 1919, measuring 400 feet from bow to stern. She was not designed for combat, nor was she built for speed. She was a beast of burden, designed to move raw materials across the empire at a slow, efficient pace. By February 1941, the Gersapa was nearing the end of a grueling voyage that had begun months earlier in Calcutta, India. Her holds were packed to capacity. The manifest listed 7,000 tons of cargo, a massive weight that forced her hull deep into the waterline. The bulk of this load was pig iron and tea, essential supplies for a besieging island nation. Buried deeper within the secure lockers was a far more specific cargo, nearly 200 tons of silver bullion. The silver, valued at £600,000 in 1941 currency, was intended for the Royal Mint to fund the war effort. The sheer density of the iron and silver meant the ship was heavy and sluggish, reacting slowly to the helm. The human element aboard the Gersapa consisted of 86 men. The command structure was British, led by Captain Gerald Hyland, a seasoned mariner. However, the majority of the crew were Lascars, seamen from the Indian subcontinent who formed the backbone of the Merchant Navy's labor force below decks. They worked the coal-fired furnaces and maintained the machinery, living and working in conditions that were arduous even in peacetime. By this stage of the war, the crew was exhausted. They had navigated the dangerous waters around the Cape of Good Hope and crawled north toward Sierra Leone to join convoy SL-64. The convoy system was the primary defense against the German U-boat Wolf Packs. By grouping dozens of merchant ships together and surrounding them with naval escorts, the Admiralty hoped to deter attacks or overwhelm the attackers. However, convoy SL-64 was ill-fated from the start. It was an unescorted convoy, relying solely on the vastness of the ocean for protection. The journey north from Freetown had been punished by high winds and heavy swells. The weather acted as a brake, forcing the heavy Gersapa to burn through her coal reserves at an alarming rate just to maintain position. As the convoy approached the darker waters of the North Atlantic, Captain Hyland faced a mathematical crisis. The ship did not have enough fuel to reach Liverpool at the convoy's speed. The options were stark. If they remained with the group, they would drift powerless in the open ocean once the coal ran dry. If they left the convoy, they could take a more direct, shorter route to Galway, Ireland, to refuel. But leaving the convoy meant losing the collective anonymity of the group. It meant becoming a solitary silhouette on the open sea. Captain Hyland made the decision based on the tangible reality of his fuel gauge. On February 14, 1941, the Gersapa signaled her intentions and peeled away from convoy SL-64. She altered her course toward the Irish coast, reducing her speed to 5 knots to conserve every shovelful of coal. For 2 days, the ship steamed alone. The weather worsened, the waves hammering the heavy iron hull. Without the visual reference of other ships, the isolation was total. They were a single, slow-moving point of heat and noise in a vast, freezing void. They were no longer part of a fleet, they were a target. On the night of February 17, 1941, the cloud cover was heavy, blotting out the moon. The Gersapa was running without lights, a standard procedure to avoid detection, but the wake of a 400-foot vessel is difficult to hide in a calm sea. At 10 minutes past midnight, the German submarine U-101, commanded by Ernst Mengersen, acquired the target. Mengersen did not need to submerge. He approached on the surface, confident in the darkness and the Gersapa's lack of defensive escorts. He fired a spread of torpedoes. 3 missed. The 4th did not. The torpedo struck the starboard side, tearing open the number 2 hold. The explosion was not merely a puncture, it was a structural catastrophe. Because the hold was packed with heavy pig iron, the ship did not have the resilience of a vessel carrying lighter cargo. The dead weight dragged the bow down immediately. The shockwave snapped the wireless antenna, instantly severing the ship's connection to the outside world. The radio operator attempted to tap out a distress code, but the signal died before it could be completed. Chaos on deck was absolute but brief. The lights failed, plunging the crew into total darkness as the list to starboard became severe. The angle of the deck made the launching of lifeboats a geometric impossibility on the port side. The crew struggled with the starboard davits, fighting against gravity and the freezing spray. 2 lifeboats were destroyed during the launch, smashed against the rivets of the hull by the heavy swell. A 3rd boat swamped upon hitting the water, spilling its occupants into the freezing Atlantic. Only 1 lifeboat cleared the hull successfully. The Gersapa died quickly. Within 20 minutes of the impact, a boiler explosion ripped through the vessel as the cold seawater hit the superheated furnaces. A massive column of steam and debris erupted, and then the ship simply slid beneath the surface. The U-boat lingered briefly to confirm the kill, then turned its bow away, vanishing into the night. Left behind, floating on the black, oil-slicked swells, were the remnants of the crew. 86 men had been aboard. As the noise of the sinking faded, the ocean returned to its baseline state of quiet. In that silence, scattered across the debris field, men began to swim toward the single remaining boat. The single lifeboat was designed to hold perhaps 20 men comfortably. By the time the swimming stopped and the last survivor was hauled over the gunwale, there were 32 people crammed inside. It was a 20-foot open whaler, a small, wooden shell exposed entirely to the sky. The immediate crisis was containment. The boat was dangerously overloaded. The freeboard, the distance between the waterline and the edge of the boat, was only inches. Any significant wave threatened to swamp them. The men sat knee to knee, shoulder to shoulder, a huddled mass of wet wool and shivering flesh. Among them lay the ship's captain, Gerald Hyland, but he was physically shattered, having been pulled from the water in a state of near collapse. In the vacuum of authority, Second Officer Richard Ayres took command. Ayres was a man of practical, rigid discipline. He understood immediately that their survival depended less on navigation and more on the management of entropy. If panic set in, the boat would capsize. If they drank the water too fast, they would die of dehydration. If they fought, they would expend fatal energy. Ayres conducted an inventory at dawn. The supplies were meager, a few tins of hardtack biscuits, a small quantity of condensed milk, and a limited supply of fresh water in a wooden keg. There were no flares. The compass was damaged. There were sails, but the mast had to be stepped carefully in the crowded space. Ayres established a regime of absolute rationing. Each man was allotted a few drops of water and a fraction of a biscuit per day. The water was dispensed in the lid of a tin, a ritual that became the central event of their existence. The condensed milk was saved for the Lascar crewmen, many of whom were younger and appeared to be suffering more acutely from the cold. For the first week, the Society of 32 held together. They erected a canvas cover to shield themselves from the spray, huddling under it like animals in a burrow. They took turns bailing, a ceaseless task that required 2 men to scoop water constantly to keep the boat afloat. They set a course east. Ayres, using the position of the stars and the sun when visible, estimated they were roughly 300 miles from the coast. At an average sailing speed of 2 knots, it was a journey of 6 or 7 days. It was a manageable equation. But the Atlantic weather did not cooperate. A gale rose on the 3rd day, forcing them to drop the sail and ride out the swells on a sea anchor. The boat pitched violently, tossing the exhausted men against one another. Seasickness was rampant, accelerating dehydration. The canvas cover was torn away, leaving them fully exposed to the freezing spray. Despite this, discipline remained. They were a microcosm of the merchant navy, hierarchical, stoic, and focused on the procedure of survival. They spoke of food, elaborate meals they would eat in Liverpool or Bombay. They spoke of the war as a distant abstraction. They supported the weak. When a man began to hallucinate, others would hold him down gently, speaking in low, reassuring tones. They were moving, albeit slowly, toward the edge of the continental shelf. They were alive. The system Ayres had built was working. But the margin for error was non-existent, and the biological clock of 32 bodies was ticking down faster than the boat was moving forward. The cold was a patient predator, seeping into the marrow of their bones, slowing hearts and dulling minds. By the 8th day, the mathematics of survival shifted. The gale had passed, leaving behind a long, oily swell, but the damage to the human machinery was irreversible. The initial reserve of body fat and hydration that had sustained the men through the first week was gone. Now, the body began to consume itself. The first casualties were the Lascar seamen. Acclimatized to the heat of the Indian Ocean, their physiology was ill-equipped for the damp, penetrating frost of the North Atlantic. They did not struggle, they simply faded. Hypothermia is a quiet killer in its final stages. The shivering stops as the body's core temperature drops below 90 degrees. Confusion sets in, followed by lethargy. One by one, they slumped against the gunwales or slipped down into the bilge water. Ayres, watching from the stern, oversaw the rituals of disposal. There was no energy for prayers or ceremonies. As a man died, the survivors would wait for the certainty of rigor mortis or the pallor of death, and then, with great difficulty, heave the body over the side. The boat, once dangerously low in the water, began to ride higher. Thirst became the singular focus of consciousness. The water keg was nearly empty. The daily ration had been reduced to a wet rag sucked for moisture. In this state of extreme dehydration, the ocean itself became a hallucinogenic lure. The water looked clear, cool, and infinite. Despite Ayres' strict orders and warnings, some men broke. It is a biological imperative to drink, and logic collapses under that pressure. They scooped up handfuls of the Atlantic. The relief was instantaneous, but the cost was absolute. The high salt content shocked their kidneys, accelerating dehydration and poisoning the blood. Within hours, saltwater madness set in. Men who had been stoic for a week suddenly stood up, screaming at invisible ships or attempting to step out of the boat to walk home. They had to be restrained, but the restrainers were too weak to hold them. Some threw themselves overboard, others collapsed into comas and died. The hierarchy of rank dissolved. It was no longer officers and crew, it was the living and the dying. Captain Hyland passed away, his authority long since ceded to the physical reality of the situation. The radio officer died. The gunner died. By the 12th day, the silence in the boat was heavy. Of the 32 men who had climbed aboard, nearly 2/3 were gone. The remaining survivors were skeletal, their eyes sunken, their skin covered in salt sores. They drifted in a fugue state, waking only to bail water or stare at the horizon. The wind had shifted, pushing them steadily east. They were moving, but they were no longer navigating. They were cargo, carried by the currents toward a destination they no longer had the capacity to imagine. The discipline Ayres had maintained was still there, but it was brittle. There was no more talk of rescue. The horizon remained a flat, unbroken line of gray. The ocean was winning. On the morning of March 1, 1941, the 13th day, the texture of the ocean changed. The long, rolling swells of the deep Atlantic were replaced by the confused, chopping water of the coast. The wind was blowing hard from the southwest, pushing the boat with increasing speed. Through the mist, a shape solidified. It was not a cloud. It was the white tower of the Lizard Lighthouse, standing on the southernmost tip of mainland Britain. There were only 4 men left alive in the boat: Second Officer Ayres, the radio officer, a gunner, and 1 other seaman. They were emaciated, their bodies essentially shut down, kept animated only by the sudden, adrenaline-fueled realization that the ordeal was over. They had navigated 300 miles of open ocean without instruments. They had reached England. Ayres steered the boat toward Carthilian Cove, a small inlet flaked by jagged rocks. The tide was coming in, but the sea state at the Lizard is notoriously violent. The convergence of currents creates a chaotic surf even in calm weather. In a gale, it is a grinder. A Coast Guard watcher on the cliff spotted the small, battered craft. He raised the alarm, but the events in the cove moved faster than any rescue party could descend. As the lifeboat entered the surf zone, less than 50 yards from dry land, a large breaking wave caught the stern. The boat, lightened by the loss of 28 men and devoid of ballast, did not ride over the crest. It broached. The hull twisted sideways, and the next wave flipped it entirely upside down. The 4 men were thrown into the freezing surf. In their weakened state, with muscles atrophied by 13 days of immobility and starvation, they could not swim against the backwash. The radio officer and the gunner were pulled under immediately. They drowned within sight of the grass on the cliffs. Ayres, perhaps through a final reserve of strength or the capriciousness of the currents, was thrown against a rock ledge. He clung to the barnacles, the waves battering his exhausted body, until the water receded enough for him to crawl clear. He lay on the stones, unable to stand, listening to the roar of the surf that had claimed the last of his crew. Richard Ayres was pulled from the rocks by the local rescue party. He was the only survivor of the 32 men in the lifeboat, and the sole survivor of the 86 men who had sailed on the SS Gersapa. He spent months recovering in a hospital, his body ravaged by exposure, salt water, and starvation. Yet, in a testament to the quiet resolve of his generation, Ayres returned to the sea. He served the remainder of the war in the Merchant Navy, eventually receiving the Member of the Order of the British Empire, MBE, for his leadership during those 13 days. He lived a quiet life thereafter, rarely speaking of the men who had died beside him. 70 years later, in 2011, a salvage expedition located the wreck of the Gersapa sitting upright 3 miles beneath the surface. Using robotic submersibles, they cut into the steel holds and recovered 48 tons of silver bullion, the heaviest recovery of precious metal from a shipwreck in history. The silver was brought to the surface, shining and untouched by the crushing pressure or the passage of time. The bullion was returned to the mint, its monetary value intact. But the human cost of its transport remains absolute. The silver could be salvaged, the 31 men who vanished in the surf at the Lizard Point remain part of the Atlantic.